December 1944. The frozen fields of Belgium stretch endlessly under a gray sky that seems to press down on everything beneath it. Snow crunches under tank treads as American Sherman crews advance through the Ardennes forest, each man inside those steel coffins knowing the terrifying truth that every tanker whispered about in hushed tones. The German Tigers could kill them from a mile away, while their own shells bounced harmlessly off enemy armor like pebbles against a fortress wall. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 5 Shermans lost for every Tiger destroyed. Sometimes more. But this is the story of how one simple modification, born from desperation and farmyard ingenuity, turned those odds upside down and gave Sherman crews a fighting chance against the most feared war machine on the Western Front. If you're fascinated by untold stories from history and want to see more content like this, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible true stories. Sergeant James Holland pressed his face against the periscope of his Sherman tank, breathing shallow in the cramped commander's cupola. The cold metal bit into his cheekbone, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the tree line 400 yards ahead, searching for the telltale muzzle flash that would be the last thing he'd ever see. Behind him, in the turret, Corporal Mike Torelli adjusted the traverse wheel with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago, not because the fear had gone away, but because his body had simply run out of adrenaline to spare. In the driver's seat, barely visible through the bulkhead, Private Danny Kowalski gripped the steering levers with white knuckles. He was 19 years old and had been in Europe for exactly 47 days. He'd already seen 3 tanks brew up. The crews inside turned to ash before they could even scream. The other men didn't talk about it, but he knew they had all done the same mental arithmetic. Average life expectancy for a Sherman crew in combat was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The radio crackled to life, Lieutenant Morrison's voice cutting through the static with forced calm that fooled no one. Baker, 3-2, this is Baker lead. Hold position. Intelligence reports Tiger activity in Sector 7. Repeat, Tigers in Sector 7. Holland felt his stomach tighten. Tigers. The word itself had become synonymous with death. 88mm main gun that could punch through their armor from over a mile away. Frontal armor so thick that even a direct hit from their 75mm gun at point-blank range would likely just scratch the paint. The German tank weighed twice what a Sherman did and could kill anything on the battlefield with impunity. Think they'll send us in anyway? Torelli asked from below, his New York accent somehow making the question sound almost casual. Holland didn't answer right away. They both knew the answer. Command had a strategy for dealing with Tigers. A simple, brutal calculus. Send enough Shermans and eventually one would get a side shot or hit a weak point. Never mind that 4 or 5 would burn before that happened. Never mind the men inside. Movement, 11 o'clock. Kowalski's voice cracked through the intercom. Something in the trees. Holland swung his periscope left and felt his blood turn to ice water. There, partially concealed by a snow-covered pine, sat the angular, predatory silhouette of a Tiger tank. Even at this distance, nearly half a mile, the thing looked enormous. Its long gun barrel tracked slowly across the field, hunting. Tiger at 11 o'clock, Holland shouted into the radio, the training taking over even as his mind screamed at him to reverse, to run, to do anything but sit here like a target at a shooting gallery. The Tiger's gun barrel stopped moving. It had found them. Back up. Kowalski, reverse now. Holland's voice rose an octave as the Tiger's barrel made a minute adjustment, centering on their position. The Sherman lurched backward just as the world exploded into sound and fury. The Tiger's 88mm shells screamed past where they had been sitting a heartbeat before, slamming into the frozen earth and throwing up a geyser of dirt and snow. The concussion wave hit the Sherman like a physical blow, rattling every bone in Holland's body. Keep backing, into the tree line. He could hear other Shermans firing now, the distinctive crack of their 75mm guns, knowing full well their shells would do nothing at this range. It was suppressive fire. Desperate noise to make the Tiger crew think twice, to buy seconds that might mean the difference between life and death. Another Tiger round whistled overhead, this one close enough that Holland swore he could feel the heat of its passage. The Sherman crashed through underbrush, branches scraping against armor, until they were concealed in the relative safety of the forest. Everyone okay? Holland gasped, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Still here, Torelli replied, his voice shaky now that the immediate danger had passed. Jesus Christ, that was close. Baker 3-2, status report. Lieutenant Morrison's voice on the radio, steady despite the chaos. Baker 3-2 intact, sir. We're in the trees at grid 7904. Tiger still has the field. Copy that. Hold position. Air support is 30 minutes out. 30 minutes. An eternity in combat. Holland slumped back in his seat, feeling the sweat cooling on his forehead despite the December cold. This was how it went, every single time. The Tigers dictated the terms of engagement, killing from range, while American crews died trying to close the distance. That night, huddled around a fire in a ruined barn, Holland sat with crews from other tanks in their platoon. The losses had been light today, only one Sherman destroyed, 3 men dead. Light, they called it. The absurdity of that word wasn't lost on anyone. "There's got to be a better way," Torelli said, warming his hands over the flames. "We can't keep trading 5 of ours for every one of theirs." "Tell that to Eisenhower," someone muttered. Holland stared into the fire, thinking. The Tiger's armor was too thick to penetrate frontally. Everyone knew that. But the sides and rear were vulnerable if you could get close enough. The problem was getting close enough without being vaporized first. The Tigers could engage from over a mile away with their superior optics and gun. Shermans had to close to within 300 or 400 yards for any hope of a penetrating hit, and that's where crews died. "What if we didn't try to penetrate the armor?" Holland said suddenly. The others looked at him. "What are you talking about?" someone asked. "The Tiger's engine compartment, the crew hatches, the gun mantlet. These things aren't impenetrable. They're just too far away for us to hit accurately. What if we could engage at point-blank range before they knew we were there?" "Yeah, and how do you propose we teleport next to a tiger without it noticing?" Torelli asked, but there was interest in his eyes now. Holland thought about the forests they'd been fighting through, the hedgerows, the narrow village streets, close quarters where the Tiger's advantages meant nothing, where its long gun was actually a liability in tight spaces. "We use the terrain. We ambush them from concealment, but we need something that lets us move through heavy brush without getting stuck, something that breaks through hedgerows instead of going around them." The next morning, Holland found himself explaining his half-formed idea to Lieutenant Morrison. The lieutenant listened, skeptical but desperate enough to consider anything. "You want to weld scrap metal to the front of your tank?" Morrison said flatly. "Not just scrap metal, sir. Shaped like a plow blade. German hedgehog obstacles, railroad tracks, anything strong enough. We've seen how these hedgerows and forest underbrush slow us down, force us onto predictable routes where the Tigers wait. But if we could punch straight through, if we could take unexpected angles of approach..." Morrison rubbed his jaw, thinking. "Even if you could get close, you'd still need to penetrate their armor." "The sides, sir. The engine deck. At close range, under 100 yards, we can hurt them, and they can't depress their gun enough to hit us if we're right up against them." "You're talking about turning tank combat into a knife fight." "Better than standing at a distance while they pick us off, sir." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "There's a supply depot 3 miles back with a lot of German obstacles we've cleared from the roads. You've got 24 hours to build your plow and field test it. If it works, I'll authorize modifications for the whole platoon." Holland and his crew, along with a few engineers who thought they were insane, spent the next day welding. They used sections of German hedgehog obstacles, those distinctive crossed steel rails the Germans had used to block tank advances on the beaches of Normandy. The pieces were strong, heavy, and when welded to form 2 prongs angling forward from the Sherman's bow, they looked like the tusks of some mechanical beast. The engineers suggested reinforcing the mounting points and adding a slight upward angle to help lift obstacles rather than just pushing them. By nightfall, Holland's Sherman looked like it had grown steel teeth. The test came the next morning in a section of forest dense with undergrowth and fallen trees. Under normal circumstances, the Sherman would have to carefully navigate around obstacles, moving slowly, predictably. Now, Holland ordered Kowalski to drive straight at the densest section. The improvised plow hit the underbrush and simply tore through it. Small trees splintered and were pushed aside. Fallen logs lifted and rolled away. The Sherman plowed forward like an unstoppable force, opening a path where none had existed moments before. "Holy hell, it actually works," Torelli breathed, watching through his periscope as they crashed through obstacles that would have stopped them cold before. But the real test came 3 days later during a dawn patrol through a section of forest known to be prowled by German armor. Holland had positioned his tank, now designated Baker 3-2 Rhino for the improvised plow, in a thick stand of pines with good sight lines to a road junction 200 yards away. Intelligence suggested tigers use this route regularly. The plan was simple and terrifying. Wait for a tiger to pass, let it get ahead of them. Then charge from cover and hit it in the side before it could traverse its turret. It was suicide. Everyone knew it. But sitting back and being killed from 1,000 yards away was suicide too, just slower. "Contact," Kowalski whispered over the intercom. "Tiger, coming from the north." Holland's heart hammered against his ribs as the massive German tank rumbled into view. It moved with mechanical precision, its commander visible in the cupola, scanning the forest but focused on threats ahead, not from the sides in this heavy timber. "Easy," Holland breathed. "Let it pass." The Tiger rolled by their position, less than 200 yards away now. Holland could see the German markings on the turret, could count the spare track links welded to the hull for extra protection. The thing was a fortress on treads. "Now, go, go, go!" Holland shouted. Kowalski slammed the throttle forward and the Sherman burst from concealment, the improvised plow smashing through the underbrush like it wasn't even there. They covered the distance in seconds, the Tiger growing larger in Holland's periscope with terrifying speed. The German commander saw them at the last moment, his face visible through binoculars turning toward them, eyes widening. The Tiger's turret began to traverse, but they were too close, the angle too acute. "Fire! Fire now!" Holland screamed. Torelli fired at a range of less than 70 yards, hitting the Tiger's side armor just behind the front sprocket. At this distance, with a 90-degree angle, even the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate. The armor-piercing shell punched through and the Tiger shuddered, smoke beginning to pour from its engine deck. "Again, keep firing." 2 more rounds slammed into the Tiger's side, and now flames were visible. The German crew began to bail out, one man on fire, another helping him. Holland ordered cease fire. They weren't murderers. The Tiger burned, thick black smoke rising into the morning sky. "We did it." Torelli's voice was barely a whisper. "We actually killed a Tiger." Word spread through the division like wildfire. A Sherman had destroyed a Tiger in close combat. Crews who had been resigned to their fate suddenly saw possibility. Within a week, every Sherman in the battalion had been modified with improvised plow attachments, and the word Rhino became synonymous with aggressive, close-quarters tank tactics. The doctrine evolved rapidly. Rhino Shermans would use terrain to close the distance, using their new ability to move through obstacles that would have stopped them before. They hunted in the forests, in the villages, anywhere the close terrain negated the Tiger's range advantage. It wasn't always successful. Crews still died. But the psychological impact was enormous. German Tiger crews, accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement, now had to worry about ambush. They couldn't rely solely on their superior armor and gun. The hunters had become the hunted, at least some of the time. Holland's crew fought through the Battle of the Bulge using these tactics. They destroyed 2 more Tigers and several Panzer Parfus, always using the same approach. Close fast through terrain the Germans thought impassable, hit the sides or rear, and withdraw before infantry could bring up anti-tank weapons. But success bred new challenges. As word spread of the Rhino tactics, German commanders began adapting their own strategies. They started positioning Tigers in pairs, covering each other's flanks. They increased infantry support around their armor, knowing that close-quarters tank combat meant American crews would be vulnerable to Panzerfaust teams lurking in rubble and tree lines. The second encounter with a Tiger came on January 8, 1945, in the ruins of a Belgian village called Hansfeld. The town had changed hands 3 times in as many days, and what remained was a shattered skeleton of stone walls and burned timber. Holland's platoon had been ordered to clear the main road through this village, ensuring supply trucks could pass safely. The morning was bitterly cold, cold enough that the crews had to run the engines every hour just to keep the oil from freezing solid. Holland stood in the commander's cupola, his breath forming clouds of vapor as he surveyed the devastated streets ahead. The buildings on either side leaned at drunken angles, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shell craters. "This is perfect ambush country," Torelli observed from his gunner's position. He was right. Every intersection was a potential kill zone. Every pile of rubble could hide a Panzerfaust team. Every intact cellar could shelter enemy infantry waiting to strike at their vulnerable rear armor. "Baker 3-2, Baker 3-3, this is Baker lead." Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the radio. "Advance by bounds. 3-2 takes point. 3-3 covers from the church square. How copy?" "Baker 3-2 copies," Holland responded, his mouth dry despite the cold. Taking point meant being first into the unknown, or being the one who would spring any trap the Germans had set. "All right, Kowalski, take us forward. Nice and slow. Eyes open, everyone." The Sherman crept forward, the improvised plow scraping against cobblestones. The sound echoed off the ruined walls, impossibly loud in the morning stillness. Holland felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that somewhere in this maze of destruction, a German gunner had them in his sights. They passed the burned-out hulk of a German half-track, its crew still inside, frozen in death. Kowalski had to navigate around a crater that had swallowed half the street, the Sherman tilting at a precarious angle before finding purchase again. Every nerve in Holland's body screamed at him to turn back, to find another route, but there was no other route. This was the only road wide enough for supply trucks. "Movement! 2 o'clock, 2nd floor." Torelli's voice was tight with tension. Could be civilians, could be infantry. Holland swung his binoculars toward the building. A curtain moved in a glassless window. Just the wind, or someone watching? Impossible to tell. "Keep moving," he ordered, though every instinct said to stop, to investigate. but stopping made you a target. In this kind of fighting, momentum was survival. They rounded a corner and the street opened into what had once been the village market square. Now it was a debris field of overturned carts, scattered bricks, and the carcass of a burned American truck. And there, on the far side of the square, hull down behind a pile of rubble, sat a Tiger tank. The German crew had chosen their position perfectly. Only the turret and gun were visible, the hull protected by debris and a collapsed building. They commanded the entire square. Any tank trying to cross would be exposed, vulnerable, an easy kill. Tiger in the square. Back up now. Holland shouted into the radio, even as Kowalski was already throwing the Sherman into reverse. The Tiger's gun erupted with a flash of fire and smoke. The shell screamed past so close that Holland felt the displacement of air, a physical pressure that made his ears pop. The round hit the building behind them, bringing down what remained of the facade in a cascade of bricks and dust. "We can't get across," Torelli said, stating the obvious. "That thing owns the square." Holland's mind raced. The Tiger was dug in, protected. Their rhino tactics depended on mobility, on closing the distance through terrain. But here, there was nowhere to hide, no covered approach. Just 200 yards of open ground. Baker lead, this is 3-2. We've got a Tiger dug in at the market square. It's got the whole area locked down. Request support. Baker 3-2. Negative on support. Artillery is committed to the northern sector. Air support is grounded due to weather. You need to find a way through or find another route. Another route would add hours to the supply column's journey. Hours that wounded men waiting for medical supplies might not have. Holland looked at his crew. Kowalski, pale but steady. Torelli, checking his ammunition load for the 10th time. The loader? Private First Class Jimmy Chen, a quiet kid from San Francisco who never complained and always had his gun ready when needed. "What if we don't try to cross?" Holland said slowly, an idea forming. "What if we go around?" He pulled out his map, studying the village layout. The buildings formed a rough horseshoe around the square. Most were damaged, but some walls still stood. If they could get through the buildings themselves, moving from structure to structure, they could flank the Tiger's position. "You want to drive through buildings?" Kowalski asked. "That's what we've got the rhino plow for, isn't it?" It was insane. The buildings were unstable, could collapse on them at any moment. There would be no room to maneuver, no way to reverse quickly if they got stuck, but it might work. Baker lid, 3-2. We're going to attempt a flanking maneuver through the structures on the south side of the square. Maintain covering fire on the Tiger to keep their attention forward. 3-2, that's a negative. Too dangerous. Find another route. Sir, with respect, there is no other route. Not one that gets supplies through today. We can do this. There was a long pause on the radio. Finally, Morrison's voice came back, resignation clear in his tone. "Copy that, 3-2. Good hunting. 3-3 will provide covering fire on your signal." Holland took a deep breath, then keyed the intercom. "All right, here's the plan. We're going through that pharmacy on the corner. The walls look thin enough. We'll push through to the courtyard behind, then through the next building, and we should come out on the Tiger's flank. Kowalski, I need you to trust the plow. Don't stop. Don't slow down. If we get stuck in a collapsed building with a Tiger 50 yards away, we're dead." "Understood, Sarge." "Torelli, the second we have a shot. Take it. One chance is all we'll get." "Got it." "Chen, keep those rounds coming. We might need to fire fast." "Ready, Sarge." Holland looked at each of them, seeing his own fear reflected back, but also something else. Determination. Trust. They'd come through too much together to doubt each other now. "Let's go hunting." The Sherman reversed away from the square, then swung left down a side street. Holland could hear the boom of Baker 3-3's gun, the covering fire beginning. The Tiger would be focused forward now, expecting an assault from that direction. They approached the pharmacy building from the side. The structure was brick, 2 stories, with most of the upper floor already collapsed. The ground floor walls still stood, but were cracked and leaning. "Hit it," Holland ordered. Kowalski gunned the engine and the Sherman surged forward. The rhino plow struck the brick wall with tremendous force. For a moment, Holland thought the wall would hold, thought they'd simply bounce off. Then the bricks began to give way, crumbling, the entire section of wall collapsing inward. The Sherman drove through in a cloud of dust and debris, bricks clattering off the hull like hail. They were inside what had been the pharmacy. The interior was a chaos of overturned shelves, broken glass, and scattered medical supplies. The Sherman's treads crunched over everything, crushing it to powder. The ceiling groaned ominously above them, and Holland heard the crack of timbers giving way. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" he shouted as chunks of plaster and wood began raining down on the turret. They crashed through the back wall of the pharmacy, emerging into a small courtyard. A dead German soldier lay frozen in the corner, covered in a light dusting of snow. The next building, what looked like it had been a bakery, stood directly ahead. "Straight through," Holland commanded. The Sherman didn't slow. The Rhino plow tore into the bakery's wall, and this time the resistance was even less. The whole front of the building seemed to peel away, and suddenly they were through, bursting out onto a narrow alley that ran parallel to the market square. "Left! Turn left!" Holland could see the Tiger now, just beyond a low stone wall. They were on its flank, less than 50 yards away. The German crew hadn't seen them yet, focused on the Shermans providing covering fire from the square's entrance. "Torelli, target, left side." Holland's voice was ice calm now, the fear burned away by action. "Identified. Fire!" The 75mm gun roared, the breech slamming back, smoke filling the turret. Through his periscope, Holland saw the shell strike the Tiger's side armor, just above the tracks. At this range, from this angle, it punched through. The Tiger shuddered, and Holland saw the turret hatch fly open. German crewmen began to evacuate, moving with practiced urgency. Hit them again. A second round struck home, and now smoke was pouring from the Tiger's engine deck. The German commander was out of the cupola, waving his men away from the stricken vehicle. "Cease fire," Holland ordered. The Tiger was done, its crew evacuating. No need for more killing. The third Tiger kill for Baker 3-2, Rhino. But as Holland sat in his commander's seat, hands shaking with post-combat adrenaline, he realized something profound. The Rhino modification wasn't just about the physical ability to crash through obstacles. It was about the mentality it created. It made them think differently, see opportunities where before they'd seen only dead ends. The pharmacy and bakery walls had always been there, had always been penetrable by a determined tank. But without the plow, without the confidence that came from knowing they could break through barriers, they never would have tried. Word of the pharmacy assault spread as quickly as the first Tiger kill had. Crews began experimenting with urban combat tactics, using the Rhino plows to create unexpected angles of approach through damaged buildings. The modification that had started as a way to push through hedgerows and forest undergrowth had evolved into something more versatile. By mid-January, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion, the Rhino Shermans had developed an almost legendary status. German intelligence reports warned of American tanks that could attack from impossible angles, that could appear suddenly where no tank should be able to go. Some German units began abandoning their carefully prepared defensive positions, unwilling to trust that any flanks were truly secure. The psychological warfare value was immense. The Tiger had been feared because it was invincible, because fighting it meant certain death. Now that invincibility was shattered, Sherman crews still respected the Tiger, still feared its gun and armor, but they no longer felt helpless against it. On January 23, 1945, Holland's crew participated in one final engagement that would cement the Rhino tactics in American armored doctrine. A German counterattack had pushed through American lines near St. Vith, and 3 Tigers were advancing down a narrow valley road, supported by infantry and half-tracks. 2 platoons of Rhino Shermans, including Holland's Baker 3-2, were ordered to stop them. The valley was perfect terrain for the Tigers, with clear fields of fire and limited cover. A conventional engagement would have been a slaughter, but the Rhino commanders saw something different. On both sides of the valley, the slopes were covered in dense forest, the trees growing so thick that visual observation was nearly impossible beyond 100 feet. The plan was simple and audacious. 2 Rhinos would engage the Tigers from the front, drawing their attention and forcing them to stop and fight. While the German crews were focused forward, the remaining Rhinos would crash through the forest on both flanks, invisible until they emerged at point-blank range. Holland's tank was one of the flankers. They positioned themselves a half-mile up the valley slope, hidden in the tree line, waiting for the signal. The cold was intense, Holland's breath freezing on the interior of his periscope as he watched the valley floor below. Contact, the radio crackled. Tigers entering the kill zone. Through his binoculars, Holland could see the massive German tanks advancing in line, their commanders visible in the cupolas, confident in their invincibility. Behind them came the support vehicles, a textbook combined arms advance. The lead Rhino opened fire from long range, deliberately missing. The Tigers immediately stopped, their turrets traversing toward the threat. Return fire began, the 88mm guns sending shells screaming down the valley. "All flanking units, execute, execute, execute," Morrison's voice commanded. "Here we go," Holland shouted to his crew. "Kowalski, take us down the slope, fast as you can." The Sherman plunged into the forest, the Rhino plow smashing through saplings and undergrowth. Branches scraped against the hull, snow cascading off trees as they passed. The slope was treacherous, the tank sliding and fishtailing on the frozen ground, but Kowalski kept the treads churning, kept them moving forward. They crashed through the forest like a metal avalanche, And suddenly they were at the valley floor, bursting from the tree line less than 100 yards from the nearest tiger. On the opposite side of the valley, Holland could see two more rhinos emerging simultaneously. The German crews were caught completely off guard. The tiger commanders were turned in their cupolas, focused on the threat ahead when death came from the flanks. Holland's tank fired first, Torelli's shot hitting the tiger's side at a perfect 90-degree angle. The armor-piercing round penetrated, and the tiger immediately began to burn. All along the valley floor, the ambush unfolded with devastating effect. 6 rhino Shermans against 3 tigers, and for once, the Americans had every advantage. Close range, flank shots, surprise. The engagement was over in less than 3 minutes. All 3 tigers destroyed. The German infantry in half tracks, retreating in disorder up the valley. Not a single American tank was lost. That night, the crews gathered in an abandoned German bunker, warming themselves around a fire made from broken furniture. The room was crowded with tankers from 6 different crews, men who had just participated in what would later be called a perfect ambush. But there was no celebration, no triumphant boasting, just quiet exhaustion and the unspoken relief of having survived another day. Holland found Lieutenant Morrison standing outside, smoking a cigarette and staring at the stars. The sky had cleared for the first time in days, and the temperature had dropped even further. Their breath hung in clouds between them. "Hell of a thing you started, Sergeant," Morrison said quietly. "Command is talking about making the Rhino modification standard issue. Word is they're going to start welding proper cutters in the factories back home." Holland nodded, not sure how to feel about that. Pride, certainly, but also a strange melancholy. "How many crews have we lost since we started this?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "In our battalion, 12 tanks, 31 men killed, 17 wounded." "And before the Rhino tactics?" "In the same time period, the month before we started modifying the tanks, we lost 23 tanks and over 70 men. The numbers were stark. The modification had saved lives, there was no denying it. But 31 men were still dead. 31 families would receive telegrams that would shatter their worlds." Holland thought about each face, each name. Thompson, who'd been killed when his tank hit a mine while trying to flank a Panther. Rodriguez, whose Sherman had taken an 88 through the turret from a hidden anti-tank gun. Martinez, Chen's replacement after Chen had been wounded by shrapnel during the St. Vith engagement. "Sir, do you think we're making a difference? I mean, in the bigger picture?" Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the darkness. "The intelligence boys say German armor commanders are changing their tactics because of us. They're more cautious now, more defensive. They can't just sit back and dominate the battlefield anymore. That's got to be worth something. But the war is going to be won by numbers, isn't it? Industrial capacity, the Russians on the Eastern Front, all those B-17s dropping bombs on German cities. What difference does it make if a few Sherman crews figured out how to fight tigers better?" "You know what I think?" Morrison said. "I think wars are won by numbers, sure, but battles are won by men who refuse to accept that they're supposed to lose. You gave these crews hope, Holland. You gave them a way to fight back. That matters more than you know." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the war continued even in these quiet moments. "Get some sleep, Sergeant," Morrison finally said. "We move out at 0600. Intelligence thinks there's a Panther platoon dug in near Malmedy." "Yes, sir." Holland returned to the bunker, finding his crew already asleep in various corners, wrapped in whatever blankets and coats they'd been able to scavenge. He sat down next to Torelli, his back against the cold stone wall, and closed his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the engagements, the close calls, the moments when death had missed them by inches, the Tiger commander's face as they'd ambushed him in Hansfeld, the surprise and fear as he'd realized his invincible tank was suddenly vulnerable. The German crews evacuating their burning vehicles, young men just like Holland's crew, just trying to survive a war none of them had started. The next morning brought new orders and new dangers. The push into Germany was beginning in earnest now, the Allied armies recovering from the shock of the Ardennes offensive and preparing for the final drive to the Rhine. The Rhino Shermans were being deployed as breakthrough units, using their unique capabilities to exploit weak points in German defensive lines. February 1945 found Holland's crew fighting through the Siegfried Line, the massive fortification system the Germans had built along their western border. The concrete bunkers and Dragon's Teeth anti-tank obstacles would have been nightmares for conventional armor. But the Rhino plows, designed to break through hedgerows, proved equally effective at clearing paths through the lighter obstacles. It was during these operations that the true versatility of the modification became apparent. Crews began using the plows to push disabled vehicles off roads, to clear rubble from bombed-out streets, even to demolish damaged buildings that threatened to collapse on advancing infantry. The simple welded steel teeth had become a multi-purpose tool that made the Sherman more than just a gun platform. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Holland's crew received an unexpected visitor. A young lieutenant from divisional headquarters arrived in a jeep, carrying a canvas bag and looking nervous. His uniform was too clean, marking him as someone who spent most of his time well behind the lines. "Sergeant Holland?" the lieutenant asked, saluting. "That's me. I'm Lieutenant Patterson from G2. I've been ordered to interview you and your crew about the Rhino modification and tactics. Command wants to compile a manual for training purposes." Holland almost laughed. A manual. They were going to turn desperate improvisation into doctrine, codify survival instincts into regulation procedure. But he supposed that's how armies worked. Someone does something that works, and it gets turned into a lesson for everyone else. The interview took most of the afternoon, Patterson asking detailed questions about everything from the welding techniques to the tactical decision-making process. Torelli demonstrated the gun-laying procedures they'd developed for snapshots at close range. Kowalski explained how driving with the plow required different techniques, how the added weight changed the Sherman's handling characteristics. "One more question," Patterson said, consulting his notes. "In your opinion, what's the single most important factor in the success of the Rhino tactics?" Holland thought about that. The plow itself, the element of surprise, the willingness to close to point-blank range? "Aggression," he finally said. Not recklessness, but controlled aggression. The mindset that you're hunting the enemy, not just reacting to them. The Rhino gives us a tool, but the tool is useless if you don't have the guts to use it. You have to be willing to drive your tank through a wall, through a forest, straight at a tiger that could kill you with one shot. That's what makes it work. Patterson scribbled furiously in his notebook. "And that's something that can be taught?" "I don't know," Holland admitted. "Fear is natural. Every man in a tank is scared, and any man who says otherwise is a liar. But you can learn to act despite the fear, to trust your crew and your equipment. That's what we do, every day, every engagement. We're scared, but we don't let the fear stop us." On Christmas Eve 1944, during a brief lull in the fighting, Holland sat on the turret of his battered Sherman, watching snow fall on the quiet battlefield. The improvised plow, dented and scarred from a dozen engagements, still jutted forward from the bow like a badge of honor. Torelli climbed up beside him, offering a cigarette. "Think we'll make it home?" he asked. Holland took the cigarette, lit it, and considered the question. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I think we will." It wasn't bravado or false confidence. It was something deeper. They'd found a way to fight back, to even the odds. The innovation hadn't come from generals or engineers in safe rear areas. It had come from desperation, from men who refused to accept that their only role was to die in greater numbers than the enemy. The Rhino modification never made it into official doctrine. It wasn't produced in factories or issued as standard equipment. It remained what it had always been, a field expedient, a soldier's solution to an impossible problem. But word spread. Other units adopted similar modifications. Some used bulldozer blades, others welded captured German steel to their hulls. Each crew adapted the basic concept to their own needs. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the Tiger had lost its mythical status. It was still a formidable weapon, still dangerous, but it was no longer invincible. Sherman crews had learned they could win if they were smart, if they were aggressive, if they used terrain and tactics instead of just armor and guns. Holland's crew survived the war, all of them, against odds that would have been unthinkable in those dark December days. When they finally returned to the United States in the summer of 1945, they brought with them photographs of their Sherman, the improvised tusks still welded to its bow, now covered in the chalked names of destroyed German tanks. Decades later, historians would analyze the innovation that came to be known as the Rhino modification. They would note how it represented a fundamental shift in American armored doctrine, how it demonstrated the importance of initiative at the unit level, how desperation and ingenuity could overcome seemingly insurmountable technological disadvantages. But for Holland and the men who fought in those modified Shermans, the lesson was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't found in the thickness of armor or the caliber of guns. Sometimes it's found in refusing to accept the odds, in adapting, in finding a way to bring the fight to the enemy on your own terms. The mathematical equation that had seemed so brutally simple at the beginning, 5 Shermans for every Tiger, had been disrupted not by better tanks or more powerful weapons, but by tactics born of necessity and courage. The Rhino crews didn't try to outgun the Tigers or outarmor them. They changed the nature of the engagement itself, turning what had been a long-range execution into a close-quarters fight where skill and aggression mattered more than technical specifications. In the final accounting, the Rhino modification and the tactics it enabled saved countless American lives, not because it made the Sherman a better tank, but because it gave crews hope, gave them agency, gave them a way to fight back against an enemy that had seemed unbeatable. The farmer who would later inspire the more organized Cullen hedgerow cutter was Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. But the spirit of innovation, the willingness to adapt and overcome, existed in crews across the European theater, men like Holland and his crew, whose names history didn't record but whose contributions were no less vital. As the last Tiger tanks fell silent and the war in Europe ended, the Rhino Shermans remained as testament to a simple truth. In war, as in life, you don't always need the biggest weapon or the thickest armor. Sometimes you just need the courage to get close enough to make your weapon count, and the ingenuity to find a way through obstacles others thought impassable. The improvised steel tusks that had turned vulnerable Shermans into aggressive predators became more than just scrap metal welded to tank hulls. They became symbols of the American soldiers' refusal to accept defeat, their ability to adapt and overcome, their willingness to risk everything for their brothers in arms. And in those desperate winter battles of 1944, when the outcome of the war still hung in the balance, that made all the difference.